Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome to another Blender tutorial. I'm really excited for today's, just because it's sort of a redo of one I did a long time ago, but now with all of, all the up-to-date stuff in the CG world. So a long time ago I made a tutorial on how to make a realistic wooden floor. The output looked something like this. This was 5 years ago, and it wasn't super difficult, but there were lots of nicks and tricks and stuff used to make it look realistic, and now it's so incredibly easy. So I figured it would be good to break down the process of making a realistic wooden floor in Blender 3.0, using and how easy it can be, and how all the nifty things you can do to make your floor look really special and unique. So this is going to be the output of the tutorial. I'm going to show you where to get textures and HDRI and how to download them and use them in Blender. And there are easier ways to do it, but I'm going to walk you through every single step. So we're going to go through and see why everything works the way it does. And the best part is this workflow is going to work well for both cycles and Eevee. So this is the cycles output, but here's how it looks in Eevee with no changes whatsoever. So this is going to be, I'm hyped for today. So let's dive right into it. So first thing you're going to want to do is, as usual, open up Blender and delete everything except for the default, delete everything including the default cube. I'm just going to save this real quick. All right, so we've got our scene, and now we're going to add our floor. That's super easy. Just Shift A to add a plane, and hit S and scale it up pretty large, like maybe by a factor of like 5 or 6. So if you hit S and scale it just generically, you can scale it in any direction, right? If you hit X, it'll scale in the X. Y, it'll scale in the Y. Z, well, it's a plane, so it won't scale in the Z. But we're just going to scale it up generically. So just hit S and type, let's say 7 on your number pad, and that will scale it up 7 times and give us this nice floor to work with. Now we're going to set up the camera. So we're going to want to have the camera sort of looking down onto it, so we can capture reflections from the world environments. And we want to have some nice depth of field, so we want the plane to fill the view, basically. We want the floor to be the main subject here. So we're going to go Shift A and then scroll down to camera, click on camera to add it. And if we hit Control Alt 0, it'll snap the camera view to our current view. If you don't have a number pad, you can just go to View and then Align View and Align Active Camera. View, Align View. You have to be out of it, sorry. View, Align Active Camera to View, and that'll snap the camera into your current view. So we're going to take the camera now, and we're just going to move it around from the camera perspective. So if we hit G and then Z twice, we'll be able to move the camera in and out. So we're just going to move it in until we're covering most of the camera with the floor, and then we'll just maneuver the camera around a bit until the whole camera is covered by the floor. And so just keep doing this, move it in a little bit, and there you go. So now if we go to a rendered view, we're not going to see anything, but the whole camera view is covered by the floor, which is exactly how we want it. Okay, so before we set up anything else, we're going to set up our HDRI. So because when I did this a while ago, I would set up lighting planes and stuff and make the lighting look how I wanted it. But what I've learned now is that as you build up the materials, the choices you make are going to be influenced by your lighting. So it's really important to start setting up your lighting first, the way you want it to look in the end, so that way you can inform your material choices, intentionally and with malice aforethought. So let's do that. We're just going to download an HDRI. So there are tons of free ones available online. There's a great place called Polyhaven. So if you go to polyhaven.com, they have all sorts of free HDRIs. So go to Assets, click on HDRIs. And now we're going to look for an indoor HDRI. So click indoor, and the HDRI that we want, you can pick any one you like, but the ones I like to look for are the ones that have like really intense areas of light contrasted next to like areas of shadow, because that will look really good in a render. It's how you get these like really nice light reflections and this contrast and this interesting sort of visual eye candy. And so this looks nice. I think I want something a little bit more like diverse in color though. You can see these are not exactly what we're looking for because they don't have any of these like areas of light and shadow, whereas this looks good, it looks cool. I like that. Okay. Maybe. Okay, this is perfect. So you can see we've got nice colors and we got lots of light and dark areas coming in from the windows. So this is going to be a perfect one. So let's download it right now. You don't need it to be very high resolution since the HDRI isn't going to be in the view of the camera, so it doesn't matter how high resolution it is. So let's just stick with 4K, make sure it's in HDR format. Oops, I'm sorry. Make sure it's in HDR format and then download the HDR. And it'll take a second, 24 megabytes. So once that's done, go back to Blender and we can add the HDR to the scene. So before we do that, we're just going to switch to the Cycles rendering engine where we'll be working in primarily for the remainder of this tutorial. So in the right panel over here, just click on this Render Properties button, click Render Engine, and then change the Render Engine to Cycles. And if you have a GPU, you can switch your device from CPU to GPU compute. We're going to make sure in the Output Properties panel that we're only choosing the render region, so that way it doesn't render the whole scene when we only want to see what's in the camera. And now we can, if we go hit Z in the viewport and go to rendered, we'll see the rendered view, and which is nothing because there's no lights. So now if we go down to world properties, under surface, click on this yellow dot next to color. So what this setting does is it basically just changes the color of the background. So it's changing the color of the world at the moment, but we want the color to be an HDRI. So if we hit this yellow button next to color, click environment texture. Now it's pink because we haven't provided it with an image of some kind. Click on open and then go to your HDRI or wherever you downloaded it. For me it was in downloads, and then just click on it. And now you won't see anything, but if we move out of the camera view, you can see that our HDRI has been applied to our scene. And it doesn't look like we're not seeing anything happening to the wood floor, but there's a neat trick you can do to set up your lighting before you've even applied any textures. So let's click on the plane, and now we're going to go into the shader editor. So let's pull another viewport in. So if you just click on the top here and just click and drag in, you'll split the pane into two viewports. This will allow us to work on a texture on the left and see what we're doing on the right. So if you click up on the editor type up here and scroll down to shader editor, and you can just hit N to get rid of that window over there because we won't need it. Let's add a new texture to the plane. This will be our wood floor, so we can call it that. But we're not going to add any wood texturing just yet. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to make it very metallic and decrease the roughness. And now you can see the reflection of what's going on in the HDRI on the floor. And this will translate exactly to what will be reflected in the floor once we have all the wood textures and stuff up. So let's switch the object type to world. And now if we do that, we'll see our nodes here. So our node, we have the large, this is the image node, and then you can change the strength of the background here. We're just going to leave it at 1 for now. And then it's all piping into this world output node. But we're going to add another node. So if you go to Shift A and then type mapping, we can add a mapping node. And we're going to connect the vector output of the mapping node to the vector input of the image node. And now we're going to add a texture coordinate node. Excuse me. So Shift A and type texture coordinate. And we can take the generated output of this texture coordinate node and apply it to the vector input on our mapping node. So now if we mess around with the settings in the mapping node, you'll see it applies to the HDRI. So let's, for example, rotate this, and you can see how it's rotating the HDRI, and the reflections are being changed in the floor as well. So let's go back to our camera view, and what we want to do is we want to rotate the HDRI so that the reflections are falling on the floor in an interesting way. So if we just change the rotation until we see some light and shadow fall on the HDRI, we should be good. So I'm liking that. Is there anything more interesting? Nope, doesn't look like it. So let's stick with this. So I'm going to basically have it so that you have this area of light reflection and this interesting lighting reflection over here, and it's some faded glow over here, and then the rest is not super interesting, which is exactly how we want it. So you want these sort of contrasts of visual eye candy and sort of less interesting areas so we can see the texture. Okay, so this is actually coming along great. So let's go to the shader type and switch back to the object. And now we're just going to turn off all the settings that we did. So you can just delete the principled BSDF and replace it with a new one by going to clicking on the node, hitting X, and then doing Shift A, typing principled, and then plugging the output of the BSDF into the surface input on the material output. So this node works like any other node in the shader editor. So you can change the settings to change things like the color, right, how reflective it is, etc. And you can plug in maps and values into each of these little connection points in order to manipulate this texture however you want. And basically at the end, you'll have a bunch of nodes and they'll be all acting like a sort of pipeline where, each node represents a different setting. You're changing the setting and passing along the resulting image to the next node all the way until you get to the material output node, which is your final texture. So the first thing we need to do in order to modify this texture the way we want is we have to download some texture maps, basically. And so a really great resource for that is this website called textures.com. If you sign up for a free account, they have lots of, you can download lots of textures a day for free. It's great. So just search for wood floor, and we're going to pick something that we find interesting. I want something that's more of like, that you'd find in like a bougie house. So I'm not looking for wood planks, right? And at the same time, I'm not looking for like a wood table or like a medieval wooden roof, although I've used that texture before, and that texture is awesome. I'm looking for something reflective and interesting, something like this, the Versailles parquet. This texture is perfect, right? It's got some reflections, it's got room for some reflections. It's got this really interesting sort of dappled structure. It's seamless, which is nice. So this is perfect. So we're going to download a couple of the textures here. So we're going to need the albedo, which is the color map. So just click and download the largest one you can. And then, the largest one you can for the fewest number of credits. So since you only need 1 credit for the medium texture, I'd say just go with the medium texture. You don't need it to be super high resolution for a render like this. In fact, most of the time you won't need your floors to be super high resolution. So 1024 by 1024 is fine. We also want to download the height map, which we're going to use for displacement. We're going to want to download the normal, which we're going to use to redirect the light. We're going to want to download the roughness map, which will tell us where where everything should be reflective. And let's download the metallic map, and that's it. We don't really need the ambient occlusion, although that texture is often very helpful, but it's not going to be in this case. So just those 5 textures, and we should be good. So let's start manipulating them. So let's go to our rendered view in our Blender shader Blender viewport editor. Just make sure you're rendering it so that you can see the effects happen live. And now let's start adding stuff to this. So the easiest thing to add is just the color. So we're going to go Shift A, add an image texture, and we can add the image texture just by clicking Open and going to our Downloads folder or wherever you downloaded the texture and adding the image texture there. Take the color output from the image texture and plug it into the base color on the principled BSDF. And so that we can manipulate the image texture's mapping, we're going to add a mapping and a texture coordinate node, just like we did for the world map, and it will have the same effect. So if we add Shift A, search, and then add a mapping node, connect the vector output on the mapping node to the vector input on the texture coordinate node, and do the same thing as we did before, search for texture coordinate, and just take generated, plug it into the vector input. And so now we have this nifty little thing, and if we play with the rotation, you can see that it's affecting the image. So we can rotate the image texture around, and we can change the rotation, the location of the texture, etc. The most important thing that we're going to want to use this for, though, is the scale. So if you Shift A, search for value, and add a value node, you can plug in this value node into the scale, and it will affect all 3 of the scale values at once. So a value of 0 just means you're not going to see anything. A value of 1 doesn't change anything because it's just multiplying all the scale values by 1, so nothing's changing. But if we give it like 0.75, you can see it makes it a little bit bigger, which I like. And you can play with the rotation. Basically, you just want to get something that looks interesting and sort of, highlights the parts of the floor that you want to show in the render. So I like this. You can see several of the squares. It doesn't look super repetitive or organized, and you get the light falling in one area and not in another. So I think this is fine for now. Okay, let's continue. So the next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to add the metallic and roughness textures, which tell us how to reflect light, basically. So go Shift A, search. Oh, actually, you don't have to Shift A to search since we already have an image node right here. So just Shift D to duplicate this node. So if you click on it and hit Shift D, it'll duplicate it. And then connect the vector output from our mapping node into the vector input on the image node. That's important to make sure that all the textures are pointing in the same direction and have the same scale. So now we're going to change this into our metallic node. So if we go back to our wherever we downloaded the textures, just click metallic and plug in the color output from this into the metallic input on the principled BSDF. And now we're going to do the same thing for the roughness. So Shift D to duplicate this node, take the vector output from the mapping, plug it into the vector input on the new node, change the image texture to the roughness texture now, and take the color output and plug it into the roughness on the principled BSDF. And we're not done yet, don't worry. So now we're going to do the same thing again. Just click on the node, duplicate it, go from the vector output of the mapping node into the vector input on the new node, change it to our normal map, which is this blue one over here, and connect the color output. Oh, sorry, we're going to add another node actually, the normal map node. So Shift A, search for normal map. Take the color output, plug it into the strength input on the normal map node. Take the normal map output and plug it into the normal input on the principled BSDF. And now we have almost everything done here, basically. So last thing we're going to add is some displacement. So we downloaded that height map texture, and that's where that's going to come in handy. So duplicate your image node again. Do the same thing. Take the output from the vector map, plug it into the vector input on the new node. Change the image texture to the height map. And now we're going to add a displacement node. So take the color output from the displacement node, plug it into the height on the, take the color map from the height map, color output from the height map, plug it into the height input on the displacement node, and then plug the displacement node into the displacement setting on the material output. And now we have all of our settings in, but we're going to have to dial them around a bit to make them look not insane. So, wow, that looks really interesting. Okay, so let's start to work with this. So we're seeing a couple issues here. So this displacement map looks wild. So we can try to correct that by reducing the scale a little bit. So if we bring the scale down to like 0.05 or maybe even lower, like 0.01, you can see that we have something much more reasonable now. It doesn't look as completely insane. Yeah, I think that looks a lot better. So you can see we're getting these nice lines from everything, and it looks like there's something right there. Now this normal map looks kind of interesting. So if we unplug it, it's not really doing too much, which is kind of interesting. That's okay though. Sometimes normal maps don't do a lot. And in this case, this normal map isn't pulling its own weight, I guess. Okay. So that looks fine, and we want to change a couple more things. So I don't really like the way the reflections look. So let's play around with this roughness and this metallic bit. Okay, let's add a color ramp. So Shift A, color ramp node, and we're going to insert the color ramp in between the roughness texture and the roughness input. And now if we Control Shift click on the color ramp node, we'll see that this is what the roughness texture is looking like. And if we change these settings over here, we can adjust how white or black basically it is, and we can adjust the contrast level, and that lets us play with the roughness. So if we plug our principled BSDF back into the material output, we can mess around with these settings and see if we can get it to look basically however we want, which is exactly what we want. We want to be able to mess with the settings. And that's really a really important takeaway here, which is that it's always an experiment. This is a good workflow, but this is not just a step-by-step process you should follow every single time. For every single scene, you're going to want to play with these settings and make it look how you want it to look. So we're going to play with the settings here. All right, this roughness map, even though it's fine, it's not exactly doing it for me. So we are going to take this white marker here and just move it in, and you can see it softens the reflections a lot, and I think that looks a lot more realistic. Now I'm liking the way this is coming out, but I don't think it's quite there yet. So I want to I would like to tweak the color a little bit. So we can change the color of the texture. Oops. We can change the color of the texture by inserting an RGB node, RGB curves node. So search RGB curves, place it in between the image texture and the principled BSDF input. And now if we play with these RGB values, we can add more R by clicking a point on here and dragging it, or removing red, etc. And I think right now there's a little too much red, so I just want to remove a touch. And you can play with it, you know, you want to add more green, you want to add less green. I think that looks pretty good. Maybe add a little blue, so it's reflecting more of the blue light. And I think that looks perfect. So I'm quite happy with the way this texture is looking right now. I think it looks pretty decently realistic. And we're pretty much done at this point with the texture bit. So this is a good workflow for how you can make any texture in Blender. And there's a faster way to do this, which is just using the Node Wrangler add-on, which will do this automatically for you. But it's really helpful to be able to go through and play with each setting and see what every single one does. So now you know that playing with the scale on the displacement setting is going to change how crazy and wild it looks, and you want a low value generally. in order to make things look reasonable. You know what the roughness does. If you want things to be, if you want things to be more reflective, you can pull this black item towards the middle here. If you want them to be less reflective, you pull the white marker in towards the middle. So there's all sorts of really neat tricks and everything that you can use here. And we're pretty much done with this. We're just going to add a little bit of depth of field and some glare, and I'll show you how it looks in Eevee as well. So let's just add that real quick. So in order to add the depth of field, we're going to add an empty. So Shift A in the viewport, scroll down to empty, add plane axes, and you can see it pop up over there. Let's make it really big. We're going to rename the empty depth of field since it'll be controlling our depth of field. And now use G and then Shift Z to drag it in the X and Y direction, kind of closer to the camera a little bit. Now if we click on the camera and go down here to the camera settings, you can check this box to enable depth of field. For the focus object, select the depth of field empty, and now turn the f-stop down low to like 0.1 or something. And you can see you immediately get this artsy depth of field effect. And if we move the empty around, you can see it blurs based on where the empty is. And that's effectively what this is doing, and it's a really easy and quick way to add depth of field to any scene you're doing in Blender. So I'm gonna put the depth of field somewhere out of the light, like maybe right about here. That way, because the light's gonna be blurring the stuff that comes in contact with it anyway. So this will allow us to see some detail in the part of the image that isn't affected by the light, or isn't as affected by the light. So now we've got our depth of field. We're almost there. We're just going to quickly change some settings for the render. So go back to your render properties, change the max samples to just something low like 256 so it doesn't take forever. Exit out of the render view here and hit function F12 to start your render. This will be pretty fast. It should only take about 10 or 15 seconds. You can see it rendering very nicely. It looks very realistic, like a freshly waxed floor. Okay, and we're basically done. So now we're going to add some glare. So go over to your compositing tab over here, check off use nodes, and turn off the backdrop, because if we connect it to a viewer node right now, it's just going to put it in the background, and it's just hard to see what you're doing when that happens. So hit N to get rid of that side menu, and now split the view up here. Go to your image editor, click on viewer node to change the image to viewer node, and now hit Control Shift click on your node here to connect it to the viewer node, and you can now see what you're working with for the final result. So if you hit Shift A, add a glare node to the composite, and then Control Shift click to connect it to the viewer output. Change the glare type to fog glow, and change the threshold to 0, and then click up until it looks nice. So I think that threshold, maybe 0.2, yeah, 0.2 looks good. So I think that looks fine. And that's pretty much your final render for this wooden floor in Cycles. But here's the really cool thing. This whole workflow also works really well in Eevee. So if you just change the rendering engine over to Eevee with no other changes, you get a relatively similar looking result. It's kind of hard to see because of the huge amount of depth of field we've added. So I'm just going to turn that off. But you can see that you get a really similar looking result. It responds really well to the lighting. And you can see the reflections of the door and the surroundings, and it looks really good. And so this workflow works really well basically for Cycles and Eevee. So you can make the material once, set it, and forget about it. Sorry to anyone who's not seen that ad. So yeah, that's pretty much the latest way you can make a wooden floor in Blender 3.0. I hope this tutorial was helpful, and I hope it was an upgrade over the previous one from many years ago that is probably no longer useful. Thank you so much for watching. I'm trying to change up my style for these tutorials. So if you have any suggestions or comments about how or feedback on how I can improve these tutorials for you, please just let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe for more, and have a great day.